Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Leadership Live. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, and it's Friday, so that means it is time for some live Q&A. I'm here to take the questions that you may have about PR, marketing, digital agencies, and running the business of those same agencies. So if you have questions, feel free to share them in the chat. If you're watching this on replay, share things in the comments, and I will try to respond to those as well. And of course, we'll also be going to the mailbag, which you can submit your questions to in advance of the weekly show. Just go to the agencyleadership.com website and use the Ask Chip function there, or you can simply drop me an email, chip@agencyleadership.com. We've got some questions in the mailbag. I'll keep an eye out for any questions that you may have in chat. If you have additional feedback on my responses to any of the questions that we go through today, feel free to share those in the chat as well, and I'll try to integrate them in this show. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump on into it. And so our first question today came from the mailbag, and it is, how can I get feedback on how my pricing compares to other agencies? And this is a question that I get quite often. As agencies, we are always curious what the other guy or gal is getting, how much they're making. Are we leaving money on the table? Are we pricing ourselves uncompetitively? And ultimately, I've got a couple of big picture things that I want you to be thinking about here. First and foremost, you need to be focused more on your own pricing and what works for you than what the competition is setting their prices at. So it's fine and good to take notice of what other agencies are charging, because it does matter when you get to the competitive space, but start by figuring out as I've talked about before on a pricing episode of this show, you need to know your floor. What's the minimum amount that you can charge and still be profitable? And then from there, you try to figure out, what will the market bear? And so part of that is your own conversations with prospects. And by prospects, I mean the ideal client that you want to have. So one of the tricks and challenges in looking at other agencies and seeing their pricing is that their ideal client may not be exactly the same. They may even serve the same industry as you do, but their sweet spot type of project or other subtle differences can mean fairly substantial pricing differences. So you want to be careful about taking too much notice of the other guy and instead figuring out what works for you. You also want to try to think about what is fair. What do you think is fair compensation, taking into account all of the value that you're providing, taking into account the kinds of organizations that you work for and what their budgets typically are, and what kind of return on investment that they're seeing. So what do they perceive the value as? And as you come up with those things, it will help you determine your own pricing. But Chip, you say, look, I get it. I hear what you're saying, but I still want to know what that other pricing is. And so there's a couple of different ways that you can go about doing this. And some of it depends upon what industries you serve. So for example, oftentimes if you are in competitive bidding processes in the government, you can find out what the winning bidder was on a particular project. So you can't necessarily, in most cases, see all of the bids and what everybody priced at, but you can often find out what the final contract amount was. You'll still be missing some details, but it will give you a sense if you were competing in one of those open RFP processes that the government agencies will sometimes have. You'll be able to figure out if you were way outside the ballpark. So if you came in at $50,000 for the work and someone got paid $250 or someone got paid $10, you know that you were wildly outside of it. And that doesn't necessarily go directly to the component pricing, because some of the reasons why those government contracts can vary in price may be that the scope shifted as they were doing their negotiations. It may be that they change the duration of the agreement. So there is, depending upon the level of government agency that you're working with and what their level of sophistication is and the degree of flexibility that they have, sometimes changes can take place even after they've made that vendor selection. So take a look at that as one avenue. The other is to have conversations. So when you lose business to another agency, when you lose business to another agency, ask that prospect, why did you go with someone else? And in most cases, many cases, perhaps they won't be willing to be too open with you, but I've found a fair bit of success in getting at least a preliminary conversation that helps give some light to why the decision was made. And oftentimes it isn't specifically about pricing. It may be about the whole package. It may be about the type of solution. There's a lot of factors that go into a buyer's decision of which agency to select. But as part of that, they will often give you an indication of how your pricing stacked up. They may say, look, it wasn't price, you were right there, or it wasn't price, you were by far the cheapest, but what we were looking for was X, Y, or Z instead. So asking folks that chose someone else can be one way. If you've won the business, it's still helpful to go to that new client and as part of the onboarding process, have a conversation because you want to understand why they picked you. So you may think you know why you were the winning bid, but ultimately they'll share information that will help you understand what their expectations are. So I wouldn't go to them and say, so, straight up, why did you pick us? Or how much did other people charge? Or what can you tell me about agency Y's proposal? Instead, talk to them about why you were selected and what their expectations are, because that will not only give you really valuable competitive intelligence that will help you better sell your services in the future, it will also help you manage that client relationship more effectively, because it will give you great insight onto what they're expecting to see out of the partnership with your agency. And so you want to make sure that you're hitting on that, because if they selected you because you have a great design aesthetic or because you chose just the right words on the sample press release that you showed them, or they really liked some element of the strategic plan, you want to know that up front because it will help you to manage your resources more effectively and deliver the outcome and results that the client is really looking for and really feels like they need. So that's another way. An additional way that you can get some competitive intelligence is by talking to others in the industry. Sometimes if you're talking with another agency owner, they'll be pretty open about what it is that they charge. And I encourage everybody to be fairly open about the ranges of projects that they work on, whether you're talking with a prospect or frankly even another agency. There's no harm in that. If you're working with an agency or you're talking with an agency owner and you share, okay, my range of projects is typically 5 to 20,000 a month, and they say, well, they tend to be higher, so it's more 50 to 100,000 or whatever. It gives you a baseline piece of information that will help you understand the marketplace, but it also then has now set it up so that for smaller projects, perhaps they refer work to you. For larger projects that are outside of the scope that you feel like you can deliver on effectively, perhaps you refer them over to that other agency. And so being candid in these conversations can really help you grow your business by understanding what the best fit is. Because at the end of the day, if you've got a prospect that's coming to you and what they want is not in your wheelhouse, whether that's the size of the project or the type of services or the market it's serving or what have you, you want to try to help them find a solution that is the right fit, because they'll remember that. They'll refer you to other people. They will perhaps come back to you when they have a project that is more within your wheelhouse. So don't be overly secretive in this information. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to share, really specific budget information, really specific profit information with other agency owners, but try to be as open as you can be, because it will help you to better position yourself. It will help you to get the information, because if you're being open, they'll be open. And it also helps you to have that two-way referral process that really can help you grow your agency more effectively and more quickly. So hopefully there's some ideas there that you can use to try to address the competitive pricing issue. But really, at the end of the day, don't lose sight of making sure that the pricing is right for you and your agency, that the projects are right for you and your agency. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next question in the mailbag. And as I do that, as I said, feel free to share any feedback that you have in the comments and chat, or ask any additional questions on really any topic related to agency business. I'm happy to try to answer them. So, all right, let's go ahead and see if we can bring up the next question here, and we'll hop on over there. There we go. So these were actually two different questions that I've paraphrased a little bit so I could fit them onto the one slide here. And they are related. So I thought that I would touch on them both together. And so the questions are, how do I handle employee morale and motivation in these times? And how do I deal with employees who have kids who may not go back to school in the fall? And well, again, this is on the minds of a lot of agency owners, frankly, a lot of business owners right now. There remains a tremendous amount of certainty, even now. What are we, 4 months into some of these dramatic changes that we've all been experiencing? And at the beginning of everything, there was a lot of understanding on both sides. And sort of, the thing that everybody was saying is we're all in this together. And everybody was sort of kumbaya, let's all get along, let's figure out how to make this work. And as time has gone on, we've seen progressively tension build, and various folks have, reached breaking points. And there's a lot of frustration out there. There's been a lot of economic destruction that's taken place in the past few months. I do believe, unfortunately, there is more economic destruction ahead, regardless of what happens with some of the health numbers. And so we're going to have to deal with a workforce that is very much confused, concerned, uncertain themselves. They're worried. And so, how do you work with your team to increase their comfort level, to make sure that they're being productive, but also to make sure that they're being able to meet the needs that they may have outside of the office? Because we always talk about how important our talent is in the agency business. We are effectively selling our combined talent as an agency to our clients. And so we need to get the most out of people. And the way that you get most out of people is a number of different things, but one of them is making sure that they are in a generally happy place. Obviously, you are not a therapist. You are not going to be able to help them through all of the various challenges that they may be having. But as an employer, you have an obligation to try to find ways to work with them. And as we're all thinking about, do we open offices back up again in places where that is now permissible? Do we require employees to come back? Do we make it optional? What kind of mix are we going to have? What kind of changes are we making? All of this feeds into morale, and morale is directly related to motivation. And you have to keep in mind, employees have distractions. So even your best employees are probably going to have some challenge in being exactly as productive as they have been. And now keep in mind, as everybody was sort of pulling together over the last few months, everybody was putting in extra effort. And I'm seeing it now in the conversations that I'm having with agency owners, with others. There's a lot of burnout going on right now. And you may be feeling that yourself. So you need to make sure that you are taking time off to recharge yourself. You need to make sure that your team is doing that they're decompressing and clearing their minds, because typically this is the time of year when things slow down for many agencies. It's not necessarily slowing down in the same way. And a lot of folks are saying, well, I can't really go anywhere. I'm not going to be able to fly to Europe for vacation or wherever I was planning to go. And so I know a lot of people who are just saying, I'm just going to kind of work through it. Maybe I'll take a few hours here and there, but mostly I'm just going to work through it. That sounds good and sounds reasonable, but ultimately you need to be thinking about not necessarily forcing your employees to take time off, but strongly encouraging it. They need to have an opportunity to clear their minds and move on and figure out, how are they going to go to the next step. And parents, the second part of this question, people who have school-age kids at home. And by school-age, I'm talking not necessarily high schoolers like what I have myself, but younger kids who need more hands-on attention, particularly younger kids who may not be able to use Zoom on their own. They may need you to be with them if they're doing any kind of online learning. And a lot of schools, frankly, we're hearing are not going to be in person in the fall. They may be hybrid or they may be exclusively online. That's really, really challenging for any family to deal with, but it's particularly challenging if you've got employees who are in that position, because they need to figure out how to get their job done, how to meet the needs of their kids, how to share responsibilities with spouses or significant others, and just how it's all going to come together. And it's the level of understanding that we've had, I just cannot overemphasize, I think that level of understanding is going to erode. It is human nature. We're going to have pressure from clients who are frustrated, who are seeing damage to their own businesses, and they want to try to figure out how they can move forward. They need help from their agencies to do that. So they're going to, start ratcheting up the pressure on agencies in the coming months. That pressure flows downhill. And so managers are going to be pushing that down to line employees. And to the extent that you had or have motivation and morale problems now, to the extent that you have parents who are having challenges meeting their work obligations and their family obligations, that's only likely to get worse. And so you need to try to start thinking now how to deal with that. And I don't have all of the answers by any means, not even close. In fact, I've been thinking about putting together a group of agency leaders, including parents, who can talk through some of these challenges and try to come up with some innovative solutions. So if that's something you're interested in, reach out to me, drop me an email, chip@agencyleadership.com, and we'll try to figure something out there. It's just something that Gini, Dietrich, and I recorded a recent podcast episode on. So if you go to the Agency Leadership website, I think next Thursday you'll be able to catch that episode of the podcast where we start to talk through some of those issues. And it's something that she's experiencing very directly because she has an elementary school age child at home and is meeting a lot of these challenges head on. If you've got kids who aren't even in school yet, my brother has 2 kids who are not in school at all yet. That becomes even more challenging because how do you cope with that? A lot of daycares aren't going to be open either. And so if you've got a dual income family, both parents are working, you've got kids at home, the parents are now working at home, so you've got a lot of people working in a small space, living together in a small space, trying to figure out how to make schedules mesh, trying to figure out how to give the kids the support they need and still get all of their work done. That's challenging. On top of that, you have challenges about scheduling because one of the things that we've done a lot of over the past few months is be really flexible about meeting times and about allowing families to split their duties so that they're perhaps spending half a day in the morning working, then they spend some time with the kids, and then they come back online and do work at night. But as we continue moving forward with this, there's going to have to be, or not have to be, there's going to be pressure to have more regular schedules for meetings internally with clients and all that sort of thing. So you may need to think creatively about how you're using your team. So if you've got employees who have kids and are having some of these challenges, flexibility is one piece of it, but perhaps you need to rethink how you're using that talent. And maybe you have some candid conversations with the individuals about how you might be able to shift the kinds of work that they're doing. So if they were doing client-facing work that was very time-specific about when they had to have calls or meetings or get things done, perhaps they can go to a more behind-the-scenes role for a period of time to deal with it. And so these are all things that you want to think about and not necessarily just think in that straight line thinking that you all know that I hate, where it's just a question of, how do I balance this need with that need? So think about those things. Be creative. It's going to take a lot. It's going to require communication. It requires that you're having your one-on-ones. And I know I harp on this all the time, but you need to be having one-on-ones with all of your direct reports every single week. That's in a crisis or out of a crisis, but particularly important now in the midst of all that is going on. And if you say, I can't do that, I've got too many direct reports to do that, well, then you have too many direct reports and you need to look at putting in some sort of a management structure. Really, you shouldn't have more than a handful of direct reports. 5 is probably the ideal number for you to have at max, maybe 6 or 7, or if you push it, but really 5. If you can count on one hand your direct reports, that's where I'm happiest. That's where I think that you're most effective. You split them out, you have one-on-one each day of the week potentially. It's not consuming a huge portion of your day or your week, but you're having the communication that you need. And communication is how you will unearth some of the challenges that folks are having, because we've talked a lot about parents, but others have other challenges that they may have at home during these times that you're not even aware of. And open lines of communication will help uncover those. Perhaps they've got parents who have moved in and that they're helping to take care of. Maybe because of economic reasons, they have siblings or other family members who are now living together with them. And so that's creating its own set of pressures, even though it may not be the traditional parent-child things that we've been talking about. So have those communications, figure out what challenges your employees have, try to figure out how you can meet them. And of course, if you have kids yourself, you know you're feeling this firsthand. You need to work to try to figure out the solutions that are going to work, and you may need to rethink your role in order to be effective during these times. So peel back, have some communication, take a big picture look, and hopefully that will help you move through it. And the last thing I want to say on this subject is everybody is sort of operating on the assumption that we just need to figure out how to get through the next few months. Well, that's what we thought back in March, right? When in March we all said we need to shut down for a while and do these things in order to bend the curve. And now 4 months in, we're continuing to see ongoing issues that don't look like they're going to abate anytime soon. And I know there's a lot of optimism about medical solutions here that will improve things I certainly hope that's true, but you need to work on planning for your business as if this is potentially going on for quite a while. So don't think in terms of just what's a short-term solution to it. You need to start thinking about the adaptations that you're going to make to help get the most out of your team, to help them do what they need to do while still delivering results for your business and for your clients. So with that, let's go ahead and we'll get ready for the next question. And as I queue that up, I've got a comment here from Matt Searles. Matt, thanks for commenting. He says, "This is great content. I'm learning so much." Well, thank you very much, Matt. I really appreciate that. It is great to hear from you. It's been too long since we've seen each other in person. Hopefully we'll get to do that again sometime soon. But the nice thing about social media is we are able to continue to stay in touch that way. So thanks again for reaching out, and thank you for the kind words. It's always good to know that people are finding value out of these streams. I know that I find them valuable just for working on my own thought process, and I certainly enjoy doing them. So, all right, let's go back to the mailbag here, and we'll bring up the next question. And this one is, my agency is stuck at, and I deleted the actual number, but it could be 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, whatever that number is. How do I break through to the next level? And as any agency grows, there are certain levels that folks hit on that become stumbling blocks. And it varies a little bit from agency to agency, but typically 500,000 tends to be a plateau, 1 million tends to be a plateau, 2 million tends to be a plateau, and then after that, maybe 5 million, 10 million, those would probably be the next ones that you're likely to hit. Anything over 10 million, and you may not be listening to this live stream, or certainly there are far fewer of you, but I'm happy to talk with you as well. And it's not just revenue. The other stumbling block can be on number of employees. So typically getting from 0 to that first employee, and I'm not talking a contractor, I'm talking a W-2 employee, that is a huge hurdle to overcome. And frankly, that's more psychological than anything else. But then you do have breakpoints on numbers of employees around 5, and then again at 10, around 20 to 25. And it goes all the way on up. And then once you get to 150, which again, most of you listening probably aren't getting there. Once you get up above 150, there's a lot of research that says that's where organizations really change dramatically. And it has to do with sort of the network effects of the number of relationships that any one person can have and all that. But we're not going to dive too deep into that. But the bottom line is you're going to have these plateaus, so you shouldn't be upset about that. You just need to realize that they're going to happen in your business. They'll happen at multiple steps along the way, and you just need to try to think about how to solve for them. And as you're thinking about how to solve for them, you need to step back. And so if you think about it, most agencies, as I've talked about before, typically have 10 to 20 clients, somewhere in there. And so typically you're going to be having clients that are responsible for somewhere between 5 and 20% of your revenue. If most of the work that you're doing is project-based, that means that typically every month it would be 5 to 20% of the revenue is tied to any individual client project. But if you are a more focused on retainer revenue, those kinds of things, then it would be 5 to 20% of annual revenue. And again, it will vary for some outlier type of agencies, but the vast majority of you who are watching will fall into that bucket. And so if you think about it in those terms, what that means is that typically as you grow larger, you have to grow the size of your engagements. Because if you have 10 clients and you're at the $500,000 annual level, it's mostly retainer work, that would mean that you're getting on average $50,000 a year per client, right? So now if you're going to try to keep that same rough number of clients, maybe add a few, you're going to have a much higher dollar value per engagement in order to get to the $1 million level. So part of growth comes from bigger projects. Some of that may be simply repricing your existing work. And every agency that I know just about has a pricing problem. They are not charging nearly enough for many of their services. And so you need to figure out what is the profitable level for individual projects and clients. You need to have project budgets. You need to be tracking how much time and how much expense you're putting into things. And you need to make sure that you're generating the right margins that get you to the right prices. So part of the way to break through that plateau may be increasing prices. Very difficult, as we've talked about before, to do that on existing clients, much easier to do it on new work. So think about how you can bring on new people who are paying a more appropriate, a fairer price for the value that you're delivering. So that's one way to break through the plateau. The next way is to look at the kind of work that you're doing and trying to target a broader suite of services, services that are of higher value. So if you're working on more transactional press release writing or landing page development or logo design, perhaps you want to look to bigger, broader packages where you're talking about full-fledged media strategies, full-on website designs, full-on digital advertising and marketing campaigns, right? So if you think about what you're doing and you sort of grow that circle out into a slightly larger, more robust set of services that is at a higher value point, not necessarily just price point, but higher value point for your prospects and clients, that's another way to break through the plateau. Another way to break through the plateau is, yes, to add additional clients. So instead of having 10 clients, maybe you go to 15. Now you want to be careful here because you don't want to be in a scenario where you have first of all, you don't want clients where you have wild ranges in the types of engagements. So if you have clients that are only paying $1,000 a month and you have clients who are paying $100,000 a month, that's not really a healthy agency in most cases because it's very difficult to structure your team and your processes to service the $100,000 client and the $1,000 client. So you want to find your sweet spots. And so as you're looking to add additional clients, they need to look more or less like what you currently have, with some gradual increases in the size, some gradual increases in the revenue, some gradual increases in the types of services that you're providing. So yes, it's okay to go from 10 to 15, but you want to be careful that you're not spreading yourself too thin. It's very difficult, and if you look at the research, most agencies, if they're doing ongoing work for clients, it's very hard to service them once you get over about 20. It's not impossible. You can build the right structure for it, but it becomes much more difficult because everybody becomes more disengaged. And particularly for small agencies, which is most of you listening to this broadcast today, if you're a small agency, typically the owner should have some degree of familiarity with all of the clients. That doesn't mean you know all of the ins and outs of the daily activities of those clients. You shouldn't be able to speak to that for all of your clients. If you are able to, then you're spending way too much time on client service and not nearly enough on working on growing the business and managing the business itself. But you should know who are the key players for those 20 clients or 10 clients. You should know what's making them tick, and you should know the general status of sort of the red, yellow, green as far as what the health level is of the relationship between that client and your agency. And as you get bigger, it becomes much more challenging to do that effectively. So you need to really think about the different components that go into it. Finally, the other thing that you want to think about as you're looking to level up, what do you need to make changes to as far as talent? And this might be bringing in new employees. Because the employee who worked great for you at 100,000 a year in revenue is not necessarily the one that works well with you at 1 million or 10 million in revenue. Not everybody continues to come along for the ride because they don't grow at the same time the agency is, and that's okay. They don't have to necessarily, but you need to make sure that you're constantly evaluating your talent to make sure that that's not holding you back. But it may also mean that you tap into some additional talent outside the agency in the form of contractors. Or it may be that you start working with some outside advisors. Perhaps you hire an HR consultant who can help you try to figure out how to get more out of your team to level them up, because you want to continue to grow the strengths of your team in order to break through plateaus. You may need some help yourself through an executive coach or something like that to help upskill yourself as a manager. You may need other forms of advice to work on business development or strategic planning or what have you. So there are a lot of things that you can do to position your talent and your mindset in order to take it to the next level and break through those plateaus. So hopefully some good ideas there that you can use if you are feeling like you're at a plateau that you need help breaking through. As I've been talking here, I've seen a few comments that have come in here from folks in the chat. Let's see here. I've got Henry McKemby. Henry, thank you for reaching out. Again, great to hear from you. What are the components of a good one-on-one with direct reports? Okay, great. So let's talk about that. And I did reference one-on-ones earlier in the show. If you weren't here, you can go back and rewind and watch that in, I think, the first segment, the first question from the mailbag. But components of one-on-ones with direct reports. So a couple of things when it comes to these. The first and most important thing is to make sure that you're having them. The second thing that I really like to do is to make them relatively informal. And so we're obviously, for most of us, not in a position where we can do it over coffee or lunch with our direct reports. But as often as possible, I like to take the one-on-ones out of the office or conference room environment. Maybe it's just doing a walk around the block. Maybe it's going to the coffee shop. If we're doing it remotely, as most of us are right now, it may just be making sure that you're setting the tone during the conversation, that it is a more relaxed atmosphere so that you can really try to be candid on both sides, because one-on-ones are about the information exchange, but they're also about the relationship development between manager and employee. And this doesn't mean you have to be best buddies, right? There are plenty of really successful manager-employee relationships that don't involve folks who are so friendly that they just, they do things in their non-work hours. I'm not saying you have to get there, but you do need to develop a positive rapport with all of your direct reports in order to have effective communication, to get them to open up to you. And so in a one-on-one meeting, I typically like the employee to drive the agenda as much as possible. So when I'm meeting one-on-one with direct reports, I have my own list of things that I want to make sure we cover, but I always start by letting the employee focus on what they want to talk about. And that may be asking for permission or approval for things that they've previously submitted that I haven't gotten back to them on in a timely fashion, or perhaps things that they've held just for that meeting. Because keep in mind, one of the values of having these regular meetings is it allows you to consolidate a lot of these small requests and handle them all at once, instead of a constant barrage of emails back and forth or Slack messages back and forth. So let the employee drive the one-on-one, at least in the beginning of the meeting. And frankly, in most cases, if you've developed a really solid relationship with your direct reports over the course of the one-on-one, they're going to cover most of what you have on the list. In fact, I usually work with folks off of a note card that I've written down what I want to talk to them about. And in my best one-on-one meetings, they would almost always cover everything that I had on my list, unless I had some new news that they just simply weren't aware of and I needed to share with them. but you want to get to that point where you're both thinking along the same lines about the topics that you want to cover. The other thing about an effective one-on-one is you need to be doing more listening than talking. So this is not an opportunity for you to sit there and nitpick with your direct reports. It's not a place for you to sit there and critique their performance. Yes, you need to provide constructive feedback during this, but it should be a back and forth, skewing towards the employee doing more of the talking to make sure that they're getting what they need from you. And you need to be steering them in the right direction. But it's not about them showing up for a monologue from you. It's not about you playing gotcha with them and saying, well, where's this, where's that, right? You should be having a project tracking system tool of some sort that allows you to keep an eye on all of that. So that's not what these one-on-ones are for. And then if you feel that the employee is not opening up enough, you may need to prod a little bit. And there's a fine line here between prying and prodding. But you want to try to encourage them to share any concerns that they have, particularly during these times. And so you might ask open-ended questions like, are you getting the support that you need from us? Right? And that's an opportunity for them to say, well, I really could use some more flexibility on scheduling, or it would be great if we could do this to have fewer meetings. It's an opportunity for people to vent about things like Zoom fatigue and such, right? That's something that's on everybody's mind these days. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time belaboring the point here today, but I think Zoom fatigue is rubbish. I think it's meeting fatigue. We all have had meeting fatigue for as long as I have been a worker. So for the last 30 years, we've complained about in-person meetings and conference calls, and now we're simply complaining about Zoom. We've complained about email and Slack and IRC and Yammer and all whatever it is, you can always do too much of it. And so for me, the solution to things like Zoom fatigue is not turning off the camera. It's by being more intentional about the meetings that we're having, who we're including in them, how often we're having them, those kinds of things. Because generally speaking, in my view, if a meeting is worth having, it's worth having on video because it means everybody's engaged. If you want to let people multitask, they probably don't need to be in that meeting anyway. So save everybody's time, let them do what they need to do, and catch them up after the fact with an email update or something like that. So the one-on-ones give you that opportunity for people to share that kind of feedback with you and to make sure that you're able to be as responsive as possible. Some of your one-on-ones are going to be very quick. Some of them will take a lot longer. You generally want to cap them, I would say, at a half an hour. But if you have a one-on-one in a particular week that only goes 5 or 10 minutes, don't sweat it. Part of the idea of having these regularly is that it doesn't leave a lot of things on the table for people to have to feel like they have to roll in there. I mean, one of the reasons why I think a lot of you are wary of having one-on-ones with your direct reports is because A, you have too many direct reports, and B, you don't have the meetings frequently enough. And anytime that you have long gaps between meetings, there's more to cover when you do get together. So have those at least weekly one-on-ones. As I've said many, many times before, have them even if you don't think you need them. Have them even if you talk to that employee every day. There's something fundamentally different about the one-on-one structure, particularly when you allow the employee to lead the agenda and to do most of the talking, that will change the dynamic, and you will realize that there is huge value in them, even beyond what you imagined. So hopefully that helps, Henry, in giving some perspective on how you might approach doing one-on-ones. And let's see, let's go ahead. I think we've got time for at least one more question here out of the mailbag. So I will once again try to cue that up properly. There we go. How can I convince clients to share their actual budgets with me? And so this is a question. I think I actually saw this question. I made note of it. I was watching, it might have been a discussion that Carl Sakis was having on a recent YouTube video that he shared with a group of agency owners. And it just struck me as an interesting one because it's a question that I've gotten a few times lately as well from agency owners. And so anytime I think something may be on the minds of more than one of you, I'd like to try to cover it in these sessions. And so budgets, and this is This is particularly important with prospects, but it also matters with existing clients because it helps give you an understanding about how you can grow your agency effectively. But for the purposes of this, let's focus mostly on prospects because this is where it comes up most often. And having run businesses for over 2 decades, I can tell you that more often than not, when you say to a prospect, "What's your budget for this?" they will either say, "I don't know," "It depends," "I'm not telling you," uh, but it's going to be very difficult in most cases to get a solid budget figure. So how do you get there some other way? How do you get the information that you need in order to move forward? And so let's step back from there. Why do you want to know their budget, right? So there's a couple of different reasons why we are interested in this figure. The very first reason that we want to know budget is because it helps us decide if this is a lead worth pursuing. Should we continue the conversation? So effectively, the budget question is a qualifier disqualifier. And typically it's a question of, do you have enough budget for us to move forward with the conversation? It's rare that I will see a prospect say, my budget's $100,000 and you're an agency that typically does $15,000 or $20,000 projects. It's rare for me to see an agency owner say, that's too rich for our blood, that's not the right fit, right? So when we're talking about qualify, disqualify, it's really focused on the lower end. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about that higher end, but let's put a pin in that and perhaps we can discuss that a little bit later. So if we're going to try to figure out, okay, we want to qualify or disqualify you as having enough money to move forward, this is where it can be really helpful to be open with sharing ranges of the work that you typically do. And it's also a place to share minimums if you have them. And I encourage all of you, you should have a minimum budget that you will work for. And it may evolve over time. If you're breaking through plateaus, you may increase it. So if your minimum is $2,500 a month and you feel stuck at a plateau, maybe you move that minimum up to $5,000 in order to start getting the right kinds of clients. And you can often come up with this range by looking at all of the clients that you currently have or the deals that you've done over the last 12 or 18 months. But you can also use that rule of thumb that I was talking about, the 5 to 20% rule of thumb. And so if you look at what your total annual revenue is and you say, okay, if most things should fall in the 5 to 20% of that number, that helps you establish your range. It helps you figure out what perhaps your minimum ought to be. So think about those and be open to sharing those, particularly the minimum, because that will be one way that you can weed people out. Because if you say our minimum is a $10,000 project and they only have budget for $2,500, they're going to take themselves out of the running in all likelihood right away. So they didn't have to share an actual number with you that they were reluctant to put out there, but you've effectively gotten them there by sharing your minimum. When you share ranges, that's also a way for folks to provide information. So if you say, my range is typically $25,000 to $75,000 per client, then you've opened the door for them to say, well, we might be able to make the lower end of that range work. Or they might say, that's not a problem at all. Or it's a little rich, but we can make something work probably in the middle, right? So they can give you a lot of responses once you give a range that will help you to discern roughly what their budget is. And in some cases, they may not have a budget. They may be telling you the truth. In some cases, they may have an idea of what their budget is. But ultimately, clients don't really make decisions about buying services entirely based on a budget. I've had plenty of instances where I've busted my budget or I've gone way under my budget once I've done more due diligence. So I may start with a figure, but the more I learn, the more I'm likely to adjust it. So getting sort of that general reaction when you share a range can actually be more beneficial than them sharing an actual dollar number. Because what happens as soon as a prospect shares a budget figure with you? I can almost guarantee you will start developing a solution that has that particular number attached to it. That may not be the best solution. It may not even be the best way for you to maximize the amount of money because they might be willing to go over that budget figure that they've shared with you if you've put together the right package that they believe will deliver the right value. And so that's the other way that you can start driving at some of these budget questions, and that is to really dig deep on what it is that they want to see as outcomes from the work that they're doing with your agency. Because if you're talking with a prospect and they say, well, we'd like to see the work that you do help generate $500,000 in new sales, or this is for a big project launch and we need to hit 10 million on it in order for it to be a success. You've started building some business intelligence about your client or your prospect that will help you to figure out how much it ought to be worth to them, how much they ought to spend for it, and it will give you the framework for explaining it. Because if you can say, look, we believe that we can do $100,000 worth of work for you and it will lead to an additional $1 million in revenue, would that be a good solution for you? They're probably going to say 10x return on investment? Yeah, that sounds pretty good. And so then you just need to convince them that it's really going to do that there's a very high likelihood, relatively low risk that they can hit that number. So you want to be careful when you're framing these things as far as what kind of value you can deliver to make sure that it is something you solidly believe that you can deliver. So think about those things and figure out the different ways that you can come at sort of an angle with your client in order to figure out not necessarily their budget figure, but where their appetite is, where their resources are. And hopefully, with all that information in your pocket, you can do a better job of crafting a solution that will give them what they need at a price that they can afford and at a price that makes it worth your while as an agency to do the work. Let's see. With that, I think that's going to wrap us up here because we are quickly running out of time. I think based on how windy I've been today, it would take too long to answer the next question in the mailbag, so we'll save that for next Friday. And of course, if you have questions in the interim, feel free to visit the Agency Leadership website, share them with the Ask Chip function, or shoot me an email, chip@agencyleadership.com. Of course, you can see all of the videos in this Friday Q&A series, as well as lots of others, live stream and recorded at agencyleadership.tv. We're here live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can just go to YouTube and it will pop up at that time so that you can watch and participate live, ask your questions, share your feedback, and engage with other viewers. If you're looking for some additional resources, just visit the agencyleadership.com website. Lots of articles there. And if you go to the /join tab, you can join the Agency Leadership Council for free and get access to some templates and workbooks and other free resources for growing your agency. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for all of you who shared your comments and feedback and who asked your questions. And we will be back here next Monday at noon Eastern Time. Have a great weekend.